Rabbi Ruti Regan, and this is the Matan webinar on Include Respect, or how to move towards a respectful and egalitarian environment in our inclusion efforts. And I decided to do this webinar topic because I think we all agree that we all want a respectful and inclusive community, and in practice, it doesn't always work out that way, even when we try really hard and even when we think everybody's on board. For instance, this is from an article, Not Your Mitzvah Project, which I would highly recommend reading. But one thing that really struck out for me is, many times throughout my life, I have felt like I was the mitzvah project of the week. The community didn't really want me there, but knew including me was what they were supposed to do. I always felt like we were one step away from my face being on the community bulletin with the story reading something like, "We did it, we included someone with special needs, everyone. Be proud, everyone, be real proud." Okay, maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but feeling like my presence was another's mitzvah made me feel like even more like of an outsider. And so I find this as a Jew with disabilities really relatable. I know a lot of people who find this relatable, and it's really not something anyone wants or is doing on purpose, but it seems to happen a lot inadvertently. So why? What do we do about it? So I think part of the answer is to just think about shifting the approach, which is that inclusion isn't charity, it's ingathering of exiles. Our people have always been our people, whether or not they've been included. Jews with disabilities have always belonged in schools and in our community. Some of us are exiled, and we need to undo that. And I think framing it that way helps a little. And I also think the problem goes deeper than framing it in this way really quite addresses. So it's also a problem in the secular world. This is a clip from a show called Speechless. It's a family show, and one of the kids in the family doesn't speak. And here's a clip of him going to a mainstream school for the first time and how his class reacts.
He's here! He's here! More! Come on, everybody stand! Oh God, he can't stand. The ovation is insensitive. Everybody down. Sorry, we're just excited. We haven't had a student before who is taller sitting down than any of us are standing up. We're done with the clapping. Your classmates have something they want to share with you. Zachary? Zachary's cousin is deaf, so he gets it.
Why? You don't know me.
Well, we don't have to. You're an inspiration. So what do you say, Mr. President?
He says, eat a bag of... He's flattered and he'll think about it.
So nobody meant to make him feel excluded. Nobody meant to be disrespectful. They were trying to be enthusiastic and welcoming, but they ended up treating him like in the Just Not Your Mitzvah Project article, like, yay us, we included someone, and didn't end up being respectful and inclusive in the way that they all really aspired to. And this is a show, but that interaction is really realistic, and a lot of people end up on the receiving end of it. Why is this happening? How do we get past it? So how do we get here? In order to see what we can do about this, it helps to think about, why are things like this? How did we get here? So there's a legacy of institutionalization and segregation. People with disabilities being excluded from the community. And there are also professional-led efforts towards greater integration and inclusion that have brought people back in, but that have also inadvertently created some new barriers. So the first problem and the problem created by the attempt to solve the problem. So the first problem is institutionalization and exclusion from community, right? It would be hard to overstate just how deep this goes and just how thoroughly people with disabilities have been excluded from community education and work. You know, people have been seen as unworthy of going to school, unemployable, people have been sterilized against their will, people have been taken to institutions and just never even seen again by their communities. You know, I could go on. But this exclusion is so thorough, and we're seeing these reverberations all over the place. And I think that we could stand to talk about that more, but we do talk about it a fair amount. And I think everybody knows that people have been kept out of schools. We're trying to fix that. People haven't felt welcome in communities. We're trying to fix that. So I want to talk about what efforts to fix that have looked like and the additional problem being called. So there was an attempt to fix the problem of institutionalization that became really popular in the 70s. It's called normalization. The idea of normalization is that people with disabilities should be integrated into normal society, normal community settings, and that the main problem with institutionalization and segregation is that institutions don't let you have a normal life. And segregated settings don't let you have a normal life. And it's a core principle that with appropriate support, with appropriate training and accommodation, people with disabilities can become normal in every way that matters, integrate into normal society, be more or less just like everybody else. So another way to put this is that normalization treats disability as a form of deviance that's correctable. So principle is that people with disabilities are socialized to be deviant, you know, are socialized not to act appropriately, to not integrate, to be separated from the community, and that people with disabilities can be re-socialized to be normal, and by behaving in the ways considered normal, having the skills considered normative, and having the kind of emotional responses and affect considered normative. So why does this theory matter? So I think that most of us are working in contexts where normal is not a word people like to use, where normal and abnormal and being just like everybody else aren't really the ways we like to frame things. We might say things like normal is just a setting on a washer, or of course it's okay to be different, let's celebrate difference. Because while normalization was becoming the norm in the 70s and 80s, people who were not tracked into disability areas grew up hearing, you know, we're all unique and special, it's okay to be different, diversity. So I think that we don't like to talk that way, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't influence us. We might not use those words, but normalization has shaped our professional culture in fundamental ways. And inclusion work led by professionals almost always makes a lot of assumptions rooted in the normalization approach, even in contexts where words like that are taboo. And if we're aware of these assumptions and how they've influenced the structure of professional culture, it allows us to think more critically about them and to find ways around some of the barriers they've created. So what does normalization look like? Again, the underlying principle is that we should make the lives of people with disabilities more normal than is possible in an institution, which sometimes normalization has involved putting disabled people into the same places as everyone else, like going to mainstream school, getting a job, living in an apartment, being in the community center with everyone else, going to Starbucks, working at McDonald's, whatever, right? It can also mean placing people in practice settings that are designed to be somewhat similar to normal society in order to teach them how to be normal, or at least to approximate it as closely as possible, because we don't want to cause disabled people to live abnormal lives by putting them into these abnormal settings that force it on them. That's the principle, right? So another part of the principle is normalization of behavior and emotional response. Like to teach disabled people how to react to things pretty much the way everyone else does and do the things that society generally expects of people, which means that disability professionals and teachers and people pushing in inclusion teach and enforce behaviors seen as normative and teach and enforce emotional responses seen as normative. And again, most of us are operating in settings where this is not how we like to talk about things, especially with regards feelings. We don't like to talk about, you know, having people have the right feelings, but it still does influence how we do things in practice. So, and this isn't a bad thing necessarily. It does make a certain amount of sense and it does solve certain problems pretty well. There's, you know, because disabled people have been kept out, treated as inherently outside of society, and this has led to people with disabilities not having exposure to the kinds of situations where you learn how to be part of the community. And it's led to people being taught to behave in ways that end up separating them from the community, and being taught to have emotional reactions that don't fit with how people normally interact with each other and feel about things. And it's important to realize that none of this is inherent to disability. Being excluded is not caused by disability, and being without opportunities to learn skills and to be socialized along with other people is not inherent to disability. It's a factor of how our society has been constructed, and that's something we can change. So sometimes this model for integration works really well and has made a lot of things better. For instance, realizing the normalization model has really pushed the realization that we don't have to exclude students from schools. We don't have to lock people up in institutions. We don't have to take people out of their communities. We don't have to treat people as unemployable. We can really start with the assumption that in most ways, people with disabilities are like everyone else and belong everywhere. Yeah, everywhere is for everyone. Disabled people need normal access to normal spaces. So far, so good. And to give an example, again, since in our context, most of us don't like the language of normal and having the right feelings, but let's give some examples of some problems that really can be solved by teaching and enforcing norms. So if somebody screams every time they're upset, or if somebody screams and hits people every time someone bothers them, they probably have some things to learn about emotional self-regulation and how it's appropriate to respond when you're frustrated. Teaching people who get, you know, sometimes people get enraged when somebody won't go out with them. They probably need to learn about boundaries and having some perspective. Or on another level, teaching people how to ask questions, make small talk, respect people's personal space, not only be naked when it's appropriate to be naked, respect bathroom privacy, follow norms of professionalism. Like, these are things that we do expect people in our culture to learn, and that people with disabilities also need to learn, and are often seen as incapable of learning and not given opportunities to learn, or not given access to the contexts in which people learn these things. So it's also really important to apply social norms to disabled people, because when we don't, people get separated from the community, and it can lead to a lot of really bad human rights violations. So one norm that it's important to apply is if we do B'nai Mitzvah ritual for kids with disabilities who reach B'nai Mitzvah age, because applying social norms of puberty matters for everyone. Appropriate physical boundaries, you know, opening our programs to people and expecting them to act like students and participate in them. This is the good side of normalization. It's the good side of applying social norms to everyone. Another way to put it, if we want to read it within Jewish text, is that part of being a community is being obligated and having the norms apply to you and being part of normative culture. So this is from the Talmud, from Kiddushin 31a specifically. Rabbi Yosef, who was blind, said, "At first, I said if somebody agrees with the opinion that a blind person is not obligated to obey the commandments, I would throw a party for the rabbis, because I'm not obligated and yet I observe. I'm so great. But now that I've heard the opinion of Rabbi Hanina, that one who's obligated and follows the mitzvot is greater than one who is not obligated. On the contrary, if somebody tells me that I'm obligated, I'll throw a big party for the rabbis." We need the things we do to matter. We need to be seen as part of the community in a way that goes beyond aesthetic and takes into part of being a community is that we have the obligations of being part of the community, and our actions are important. So that's the good side. That's the things normalization gets right, and the ways in which normalization has had a profoundly positive influence on our professional culture and on the lives of people with disabilities. The problem with normalization is that it's also based on a lie. Socialization really is not the only difference between people with and without disabilities. Some of the differences are innate to who we are because bodies and brains are important. No amount of integration, normalcy lessons, or socializations can actually make disabled people just like everybody else. And if we believe that it can, and if we believe that people need to be normal in order to be included, we're setting people up for failure and we're perpetuating new forms of stigma. If we want to be inclusive, we need to develop the capacity to be honest. So this has led to a lot of attitudes that focus on trying to deny or downplay disability. This is, a consequence of normalization. One thing that I've heard a lot is focus
Ruti, can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Okay. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I seem to have lost my connection for a moment. So the problem with focus on the ability, not the disability. Okay. Problem with focus on the ability, not the disability, is that we need to be able to hold both if we want to have a conversation that's real. We need an honest yes and an honest no. And in order to be able to say yes, we have to be able to see no as possible. In order to be able to meaningfully speak about ability, we need to be able to acknowledge disability, or else everything we say about ability will feel like a lie. If we're pretending not to notice disability, then we're not credible when we look at ability. And if we feel like we're lying, it's hard to be inclusive. So what you know the saying, when the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail? Well, people with disabilities get hammered with normalization a lot. So we need to be able to hold space for realizing that disability-related difference is not always the problem. Sometimes becoming more normal is harmful. Sometimes becoming more normal is not even possible. And it's always harmful to force people to repeatedly attempt the impossible or to repeatedly deny reality. And that's the position that the assumptions of normalization often put people with disabilities in. So it's important to remember that sometimes we have a different problem. For instance, bigotry cannot be fixed by making people more normal. Bigotry has to be changed by changing the bigoted response, not the person who's the victim of bigotry. When becoming normal is impossible or harmful, the solution isn't to keep trying for normal anyway. The solution is to find accessibility. More broadly speaking, when a social norm is constructed in a way that makes it impossible for disabled people to actually follow the norm needs to change. Sometimes the person with the disability needs to change, sometimes the norm needs to change, sometimes both needs to change. And we always need to be careful about being open to all three possibilities. So another thing I've heard a lot is, well, you know, what's normal anyway? Normal's just a setting on a washer. Well, is it? Not exactly, because social norms do exist. You know, and social norms are not really a bad thing, because it's a good thing that we have a norm that says when somebody annoys you, it's not okay to hit them. Or, you know, when you're at work, you need to be professional and not overshare. Or, you know, kids need to learn and teachers need to be nice to them. Or we expect everyone to learn certain things. Problem isn't that we have norms. The problem is that our current normal doesn't have a lot of room for disability and people with disabilities, and that our norms need to change so that they can include everyone instead of telling some people that they're deviant. Part of how we recognize norms that need to change, to remember that understanding a norm does not create the ability to follow that norm. You can explain broomsticks to me till you're blue in the face. You can tell me that it's socially appropriate to fly a broomstick rather than walking or driving somewhere. I'm still not going to be able to do it because I'm not a wizard. I'm not a witch. My body doesn't work that way. You know, and if you tell me that driving is a normative expectation of adults, that's still not going to make it safe for me to do it. Similarly, knowing that speech is socially expected does not create the ability to speak. Knowing that the way you speak is weird does not create the ability to speak normally. Understanding that people think eye contact is important doesn't create the ability to understand language while looking at someone's face, or to make eye contact without it being unbearably painful. Understanding that reading is important does not replace the need for Braille, and so on. Like, teaching someone what the norm is only solves the problem if the problem is that they don't know that. You know, you can't teach someone to stop being disabled, and you can't teach someone to have a body and a brain that works just like everybody else's. Similarly, even when following a norm is possible or close to possible, it can be harmful. Because, for instance, being required to have the same emotional response as everyone around you, even when your reality is different. For instance, when you're having a fun field trip, but it's not accessible to you, and somebody, brought food for everyone else, but forgot about your allergies, and you can't participate and have no idea what's going on. If you're expected to be happy and look happy just like everyone else and have no emotional response to the way you're being treated, that's a problem, even if you're capable of doing it. You know, being expected to like everything others like and dislike is also not good. Not being allowed to be unusually interested in anyone thing. Maybe people can do that, but it's probably not good. Another example is that kids who would probably be better off using wheelchairs are often pushed into spending a lot of their childhood working on walking, even if they only manage to ever get a few steps and it's not a good way for them to get around. Even when stuff's possible or close to possible, it's not always wise, advisable, safe, or a good use of anyone's time. So this is a reason that Oscar the Grouch is my hero, right? Oscar the Grouch is absolutely unapologetic about liking what he likes and disliking what he dislikes, even though other people think he's weird. You know, Oscar the Grouch holds space for liking different things isn't a problem that needs to be solved. Liking different things just means you like different things, or you might feel different about some stuff. So, you know, normalization can integrate people, but it can also lead us to do things that are harmful. While we really mean well and really want to help people, it can lead us to do things that end up being harmful. One thing that's really common in disability services, is deciding that people need to have age-appropriate interests, and say taking away a 40-year-old dolls because dolls aren't considered age-appropriate for a middle-aged person, or forcing autistic people to make eye contact at all costs, even when it damages their ability to communicate, preventing people with disabilities from interacting with each other, not letting people do things that look different, assuming people with disabilities are wrong. These are things that very well-meaning people do a lot of the time because they want people to integrate and assume that integration always means looking just like everybody else, even though sometimes it doesn't. So we should keep in mind, when somebody is considered abnormal, or I think the way we're more inclined to put it is inappropriate. You know, we don't usually say normal, we usually say appropriate, inappropriate in most of our contexts, I think. But when there are three possibilities and we always need to take all of them seriously. Sometimes someone needs to learn how to do the normal thing or how to have appropriate responses and behaviors. Sometimes the norms need to change. Sometimes the disabled person needs to change in some ways and the norm needs to change in others. Figuring out which is which gets complicated because so part of how we get good at figuring out when norms are problems is by paying attention to disability acceptance Okay. Or another way to put this is that positive thinking is not an alternative to disability acceptance. As Stella Young, a disabled comedian who said some incredible things that I would encourage you to check out, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. And if we use smiling and positive reinforcement, encouragement, positivity, when we should be creating accessibility, we might feel good for a while, but it doesn't work, and it will not create the kind of communities we're looking for. Also, editing out someone's disability isn't actually possible. If you say, this woman is, keep flapping your arms and trying to fly, you can do it, I believe in you. That's not positivity, that's degrading. And when we do the moral equivalent of that to people with disabilities, that's also degrading. So part of how we're positive is by acknowledging reality and really respecting where someone is and what they can do and how they can do it. We can do more when we accept reality than when we deny it. Because when you give up false hope, you can have the real kind. You stop wasting time on the impossible, you have so much more time and energy to do the things that you can do in the ways that you can do them. And accepting disability, accepting that you're going to be different, lets you find different ways to do things without feeling so ashamed of it. So we can do more when we accept reality. We can do more when we make sense for, when we make room for difference and accept that disability will matter sometimes. Another thing that can help us with this is to listen to disability rights activists, because disability rights activists are much better at disability acceptance than disability professionals are, because normalization is central to professional culture of inclusion. Disability acceptance is central to disabled disability rights activism. And so while normalization has accomplished some positive things, disability acceptance is a missing element that's really strong in disability communities led by disabled activists. So when we learn disability acceptance from disability rights culture and disabled leaders, it can make us much stronger as inclusion professionals because they're better at this kind of element. So the other problem with normalization, it sets disabled people up for failure. It also sets inclusion professionals up for failure. Because it's not actually possible to erase disability. No amount of smiling on our part, no amount of positive thinking, no amount of really, really trying can actually make disability irrelevant. It's gonna matter no matter how hard we try. And when we constantly attempt the impossible, it leads to misery, it leads to us feeling humiliated by failures, and it leads to burnout. For our own sake as well as inclusion professionals, we need room for honesty, and we need room for defining success in ways that are possible. And part of that is that we need to be able to acknowledge disability without conflating it with stigma and segregation. And this has actually been studied. The relationship between burnout and normalization has actually been directly studied. So sociologist Martha Kopp embedded at a work training facility, sheltered workshop, for adults with intellectual disabilities that was in which the workers were supposed to socialize disabled people out of disability and into workplace-related behavior and into being normal citizens. The problem is trying to normalize disabled adults through the power of positive thinking and positive reinforcement didn't actually work. Like, it didn't make anyone feel the way they were supposed to feel. And trying to do impossible things made staff burn out, it made staff lash out, and it made people with disabilities also, angry and rebel. So this has actually been studied. We know that normalization and futile efforts to make disability irrelevant lead to burnout and cause us a number of other problems. So how do we move towards respectful inclusion work? Like, keeping in mind that normalization got people back to our communities in some ways, but also excluded people in other ways. How do we move towards respect-focused inclusion work? Part of it is, as always, realizing that this is complicated. It's going to stay complicated. There probably aren't going to be a lot of easy answers, and it's going to take us time to figure this out. That said, we do know something about questions worth asking when difficulties arrive. One question we should really be careful to ask is, when there is a conflict, is it possible that the disabled person is right? We're socialized as inclusion professionals steeped in normalization assumptions to assume that when there's a conflict or a difficulty involving a disabled person, that the problem is that the disabled person is behaving inappropriately or responding inappropriately, and that they need to be told how to be appropriate or taught how to be appropriate. And again, sometimes that's true, and sometimes it isn't, and we need to be careful not to jump to that conclusion. Consider the possibility that they are right, and if you disagree with them, know why you disagree, and be careful of the implicit bias that leads us to assume that disabled people are always wrong when there's a difficulty. Another question to ask yourself: have I listened? What does the disabled person think is going on in this situation? Why do you think that? How do you know? What do you think? What do you think about what's going on and about their perspective on it? And why do you think that? Have you listened? How have you thought about what you've listened to? Because a lot of times, since we're socialized to assume that people with disabilities are wrong, we're also socialized not to listen to them, because we're socialized not to realize that they have a perspective that might be correct, that they might know something we don't, and that they're worth hearing out. So since we're socialized to ignore that possibility, we need to be really proactive about listening. Another question worth asking is, do they know something I don't? Because again, we're socialized to assume that the answer to this is no, and that the problem is that the disabled person is wrong. But if you live with a disability every day, you learn something about it. Chances are high that the person with the disability who you're interacting with knows something you don't. Even if you have a disability too, even if you have the same disability they do, they live with their disability and how it affects them every day. And that's a lot of experience and expertise. So listen to them, consider the possibility that they know something you don't, take their expertise seriously, be proactive, because this is countercultural. Another question to ask yourself is, do the people I'm trying to support feel respected? How do I know? Our attempts to be respectful don't always work. And it's really, if people don't feel respected, then our efforts at respect are probably not working very well. One reason it can be difficult to answer this question is that people with disabilities are socialized to believe that they have to please us, to please like educators, adults, disability professionals. And if they know that we want them to feel respected, they might feel like they need to convince us that they feel respected. So this can get kind of convoluted, and we need to be careful to think like, do people feel respected? How do I know? And to remember that their perspective on this is important. So am I respecting their right to have feelings? You know, are students with disabilities allowed to like things and to be enthusiastic? You know, is an autistic kid allowed to like trains? Are people allowed to be enthusiastic about things that they're good at or about things that they're bad at? are they allowed to be excited? Are they allowed to care about things? Are they allowed to be angry when they're treated disrespectfully? Are they allowed to be upset when they're left out of something fun and others would rather not think about the fact that they're being excluded? To be upset about lack of access, are they allowed to have the same range of feelings that everyone else does, including when their feelings are disability related or related to how disability and discrimination affect their circumstances? And again, this is something we have to be proactive about and do on purpose because of how ingrained the assumption is that when people with disabilities have or express inconvenient feelings, the solution we're taught to believe is that they need to be taught how to have the right feelings and how to act right. But sometimes they're not wrong, and people need to be able to have feelings related to their experiences and related to the way that disability and discrimination affect their experiences. So related to the question of being allowed to have feelings is, when people hurt people with disabilities, do the people who hurt them apologize? Often the answer to this is no. Often people with disabilities are not allowed to be upset when people hurt them, either physically by doing things that are painful to them, or by forgetting about allergies, forgetting about accessibilities, not planning an accessible lesson plan. And people with disabilities are often not allowed to express that this hurts them. And we are often pushed to not think about the fact that this hurts, but these things do hurt. And when we hurt people, we should apologize and we should try to make it right. So this is another area in which, maybe we should apply the norm to disabled people a little more, and to say that, look, the norm is that when you hurt someone, you're supposed to apologize and try to make it right. And that's also the case if they're disabled. If we hurt someone who has a disability, we should apologize and try to make it right. If we hurt someone who has a disability in a way that wouldn't have hurt someone who wasn't disabled, we should apologize and try to make it right. That norm is good and we should apply it consistently. Is their age respected? People with disabilities are often treated as much younger than they actually are. And it's important to think about that. Am I treating a teenager like a toddler? Are other people doing that? Would I think that this was an appropriate thing to share with a parent or to repeat to a parent for any other kid their age? Am I talking baby talk to a 7-year-old? All of it. Think about, am I respecting that they are the age that they are, even when their skills are different or even when they look different? People with dwarfism or people of short stature are often assumed to be 8 years old their whole life because people assume that anyone that size is 8. So just make sure, be proactive about respecting age and treating people as the age that they are. So another element of respect is, are they allowed to mention things that are not universal? So one aspect of normalization that's caused problems is because disability is seen as correctable deviance, mentioning disability is seen as stigmatizing, which has led to people with disabilities being socialized to avoid mentioning it, to avoid mentioning any aspect of their experience that is not universal and shared with all of their non-disabled peers. So that's not very respectful, because disability is part of who someone is, and sometimes their experiences are going to affect their perspective in ways that are relevant to class discussions, or relevant to planning a field trip, or relevant to, say, assessing which businesses we believe embody social justice, right? If we're talking about great local businesses that have a social justice model, is a student who's a wheelchair user allowed to say, I can't get in there because they've been refusing to build a ramp for the past 3 years? Or will they be seen as ruining the discussion? Will they be heard or will they be ignored? If somebody says, this is different for me, or I've experienced this, or we're reading a Bible verse and that Bible verse mentions blindness, can a blind student talk about how blindness affects their interpretation of that verse? If they say they don't like it being used as a metaphor, are we going to assume that they're wrong, or are we going to assume that they have a point and listen to them? Am I respecting their privacy? People with disabilities are often expected to disclose intensely personal, private things as the price of entry to spaces that we want to be in, or even just when we're anywhere, because people just feel entitled to private information about us. So are students expected to answer personal questions about their disability? Are they expected to justify in detail every time they need an accommodation? Do they have to let you talk to their doctor in order to be allowed to write with the kind of pen that works with them? Are they allowed to have the same boundaries other people do? Are you telling their parents dramatically more than you would normally share about a kid their age? For instance, if a 14-year-old with Down syndrome tells you he's gay, and you're thinking about whether to tell their kid's parents that, think about, would I usually consider it appropriate to repeat something like that to the parents of a 14-year-old if they asked me not to? Again, since we're socialized to correct disabled people in invasive ways, we're also often socialized to expect the right to have information that it's not really our right to have. So this is an area where applying the relevant social norm and realizing that people with disabilities have the same right to privacy as everyone else does can really help us build a stronger and more respectful inclusion culture. Related to that, another element of respect is, are their contributions to class discussions taken seriously? Sometimes the answer to this is no. One thing that I've seen happen a lot when we're trying to integrate students with disabilities is that we think more sometimes about promoting inclusion behavior rather than engaging with the content of what they're saying. So like when a student with a disability speaks up in a class discussion, is it acknowledged that they've spoken, or are they just ignored? Do people engage with the content of what they're saying? Does anyone argue with them or say, I agree, I don't agree, here's why? Is it a conversation? And even more fundamentally than that in some ways, another thing that happens is sometimes when people with disabilities speak up, they're like, oh, you did such a good job asking a question, or wow, good job speaking up. You raised your hand so well. And okay, maybe that's true, but what about the question they asked or the point they made? Like, if all you offer is praise for speaking up and you don't engage with the point, the message that's sent is, we want you to pretend, but we're not actually going to take you seriously. So when people talk, don't just praise them for talking, listen to them. So again, are questions actually being answered and engaged with? When someone asks a question, do you make sure you know what they're asking? Because people with disabilities are often not understood, either because of communication differences or because life experience can cause them to think or say something that might be unexpected, which might mean that they just get assumed to be saying something that might be more expected, or that they're saying something that's not meaningful. So it's worth checking. Make sure you understand what they're asking. So one way you can do that is, I think you said X. Am I getting that right? Just verify it. Or after you answer the question, you can say, does that answer what you were asking? So think about, when they ask, do you know what their answer, do they feel like they've been answered? How do you know? Similarly, when they're being serious, are they taken seriously? People with disabilities, especially people with intellectual disabilities, like Down syndrome or similar, are often presumed to be joking when they're not, and they're often being treated as cute when they're saying something really serious and important. I've seen so many people with Down syndrome give talks at professional inclusion conferences where they say, look, I'm 25 years old. I want to be treated like an adult. I want to drink if I feel like it, and I don't want to need to ask anyone's permission. I've seen so many people saying these totally reasonable things get laughed at and treated as cute the same way, like if a 3-year-old said, you know, I'm going to drive daddy's car today. And we need to take people seriously when they're being serious. And we need to insist that everyone around us take people seriously when they're being serious. So look and see, do you notice people with disabilities being laughed at? Do you notice that people are often assumed to be funny? And do you know whether they're being serious? I'll give an example of how this has come up. So I do an accessibility scavenger hunt where I ask students to look around to find various things that can affect access in their environment. And one of the questions I sometimes include is, what's a rule here that could create problems for someone with a disability? Now, one of the students I did this activity with once, who was someone with a disability, told me, his answer to that was, the rule that causes problems is have fun. Everybody laughed, and I wasn't so sure he was joking. So I paused for a second to wait for people to stop laughing. And I said, it sounded like you might have meant that. Do you feel like that might be true? And then he said, yeah, now that I think about it, yeah, I think I do actually mean that, but I'm not sure why. And then we had a great discussion about how have fun rules like have fun or everybody has fun at Camp Happy Fun can really cause a lot of problems for people whose experience in our programs is that they're often not included in the fun. They're often in humiliating or upsetting situations, and the rule is that you have to look happy and think everything's fun anyway, and that's really hard on them. And so by taking the possibility that someone meant it seriously, I was able to open up a really good conversation with these groups. And so if you have a student who has a disability, especially a communication disability or an intellectual disability, who's perceived as the funny one or the class clown, look at whether they're actually joking all the times they get laughed at, because there's a good chance that looking funny is safer than looking stupid, and that correcting people when they think they're joking is scary. So err on the side of taking people seriously. Look for the possibility that people who are being laughed at are actually mean something serious. Another question to be proactive about asking is, what could be made more accessible? Ask in an ongoing way, how could we make this activity building program more accessible? So accessibility isn't just a practical issue, it's also a respect issue. And one of the most fundamental and deepest ways to respect people is by remembering their access needs, and by treating their access needs as important, and to respect them enough to take them into account in an ongoing way. Don't wait for a problem to arise. Be considerate and plan for accessibility in the same way that you plan for developmental appropriateness, and pleasant experiences and things working well for people in general. Include disability and accessibility in your general practice of being considerate and kind. So a related question to ask is, will this lesson plan work for all of my students? So when a student is left out due to our failure to plan appropriately, they lose more than just that day's learning or just that day's just that day's activity or just that section's activity, every time that happens, it hurts. Being left out hurts. And being left out feels really disrespectful. And so when we fail to plan for inclusion, our students lose the sense that we respect them and that we're trustworthy. So it's important not to leave people behind. It's important to try our best to plan for access every single time. And that when we make mistakes and somebody gets hurt, that we apologize and we fix it, and we understand that something important went wrong. And that a student being left out is just as much of a problem if they're being left out because of disability. And if a lesson plan doesn't work for our students with disabilities, it doesn't work. And that's a problem that needs to be fixed, and harm that's been done that we need to apologize for. It doesn't need to be a big deal. We just need to acknowledge that something significant happened and work on fixing it. All of this is complicated. All of this is easier said than done. But what I always like to think about here is that luckily we're Jews. Jews are really good at working on hard, intractable problems and living with, imperfect solutions, difficult circumstances. Making inclusion work is hard, but making a community in the face of centuries of anti-Semitism is harder. We have a lot of transferable skills. So I have every confidence in our ability to do this, and our spiritual frameworks have a lot to offer. For instance, from the Mishnah, it is not upon us to complete the work, but neither are we free to desist from it. If we all really take that into account and look for respect in an ongoing way, we can make a real difference in people's individual lives, in our practice, in our communities, and in the world. So see that we have a couple minutes left. So I would love to take any of your questions about any of this. I'm just going to look in the chat. If you have a question you'd like to ask about any of this, please, put it in the chat. I'll answer it. What is the best way to approach a religious school director with these issues? That's huge. And I think that it depends a lot on your school and your role in the school and your relationship with them. One thing I will say is that Matan does a training program for education directors who want to get better at inclusivity practices in their school, called the Matan Institute for Education Directors. And if you want an action step that can help them to act on it, it's a program that, if they're open to it, could be really helpful. Yeah. I don't know if that's answering the right question, and I feel like this might be something where more context would be helpful in answering the right question. But another thing is that we made a set of JDAIM lesson plans that are activities schools can do for teaching kids in the school about Jewish disability issues. We have a plan, for K through 5th, one for the middle kids and one for middle and high school aged kids. And sometimes when you do these activities with kids, it can also open a discussion with the adults. And I'm sure that we can have a longer conversation about this with more context. So in Pittsburgh, all JDAIM activities will somehow be dedicated in memory of David and Cecile Rosenthal. Oh, that's really great. And I am so glad to hear that, because they are people who should be remembered. and remembered as people who mattered and were integrated in their communities. And so just want to remember everyone who was not integrated as well, because we've lost those two men with disabilities who were murdered in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And I'm glad they're being remembered. I'm glad that they're being connected. And I think that we should take that to really move forward with valuing all members of our community. So thank you so much for sharing that. Are there other questions? All right, so looks like we are at the time. If anyone else has questions or comments, please feel free to email us. I can be reached at rabbi@matankids.org. And I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for joining us and for sticking with us through the technical issues, which we'll be looking into. And let's go forward and include.